As you can see from my dress, brethren, and indeed from the view of the Mediterranean behind me, I am not in the lodge in London, and I'm not recording this in my house in Sheffield, but in Nice in south of France, where I like to spend as much time in the winter as I can. There is a connection between Nice and the Quattro Coronati, because in the cathedral in Nice, the Cathedral of Santa Reparat, there is a chapel dedicated to the Quattro Coronati, and there are large paintings of them and of their martyrdom, symbols related to them, and indeed examples of 17th century masons working tools in that chapel. I should like to thank the Brethren of Quattro Coronati Lodge for electing me their master for the coming year, 2021-22, and indeed Brother Andreas Anafosh for placing me in the chair of King Solomon. This is an installation address, brethren, and usually in Quattro Coronati Lodge, the installation address is an academic paper. I've already delivered one academic paper to the Lodge this year, a long paper on the origins of the third degree, and I'm sure nobody either in the Lodge or watching this recording would actually want me to deliver another long paper this year. So this will be an address, just a short address, and the subject of my address is the importance of primary source material and studying primary source material and not relying on secondary sources, and the dangers of doing that. It's a subject I've addressed before in the pages of AQC in 2016 in my paper on Masonic historiography. I just really want to emphasize the point here by giving 4 examples, 2 from the world of music and 2 from the world of Masonic history. I began my career in music as a performer and as a teacher and lecturer, and latterly as indeed an administrator in one of the Royal Schools of Music. I began in the University of Cambridge, and then I moved to Cardiff, Wales, to the staff of the Royal Welsh Conservatoire. And so it seems appropriate that as my first example to you of a myth widely believed, but with no historical accuracy to it at all, from the world of music. And it is a myth concerning the composer Joseph Haydn. Joseph Haydn, Viennese composer, is said to have sung in the choir of St. Stephen's Cathedral at the funeral of Antonio Vivaldi, the Italian composer, who died in Vienna in 1741. It's not true, brethren. No evidence for that whatsoever. In fact, the truth is that there was no music at Vivaldi's funeral at all. Had there been music, it is quite true that Haydn would certainly have been involved as a choir boy. But there was no music. This myth goes back to 1948 and the pages of a book on Vivaldi by a French writer called Marc Pinchel, who stated that there were 6 enfants de chœur, one of whom was Joseph Haydn, at Vivaldi's funeral. Unfortunately, Monsieur Pinchel, he had misunderstood, misread, mistranslated a word, Kuchenblüten, meaning an odd word really, meaning cowl boys, for choir boys. Cowl boys were employed for funerals. You'd have 6 and they would be all dressed like monks, if you see, with big hoods, on the cowls over their faces to make the whole thing look really sad and somber. Haydn did not sing at Vivaldi's funeral. There was no music at Vivaldi's funeral. And the primary sources are quite clear about that. But that was repeated in many, many second and tertiary sources, including the standard works on Vivaldi by Michael Tolbert and the standard 5 volumes by H.C. Robbins London on Haydn. Now, if as members of QC Lodge and members of the Correspondence Circle, brethren, you're feeling comfortable in your seats at the moment, because that's an example from musicology, I'm going to stay with Joseph Haydn and actually give you an example of another famous myth that literally was created in Quatuor Coronati Lodge. I can give you the date, brethren. It was the 4th of May, 1981. On that day, Brother John Webb delivered a paper on Joseph Haydn, and in it he made a very clear statement that the entrepreneur and musician who had brought Haydn to London for the 2 big seasons of 1791-2 and 1793-4, when Haydn had made an enormous amount of money, actually, and was very successful, enough money in the first season for him to return to Vienna and buy his own house, which I strongly recommend you to visit if ever you're in Vienna. It's, needless to say, in what is now called Haydnstrasse. And Haydn was, in fact, the very first composer ever to own his own house, because he had made so much money from that trip to London, set up by Johann Peter Salomon. Brother John Webb stated, and it was very clear in the paper, that Johann Peter Salomon was a Freemason, that he was a member of Pilgrim Lodge in London, that he had been initiated in 1782. It's not true. When Brother John Webb made those statements in QC Lodge in 1981, he knew that the minutes of Pilgrim Lodge were no longer extant, and he made the mistake of believing what the members of the lodge had told him. He did not check the primary source that was still extant, and that is, of course, the records of the Moderns Grand Lodge. If you go there, and I have gone there, you will find that there indeed were 8 initiates in Pilgrim Lodge in 1782, but no Johann Peter Salomon. With the benefits of modern technology and search materials, I can tell you that Johann Peter Salomon was never initiated into Freemasonry at any time, anywhere. He was not a Freemason. But of course, having believed what John Webb had stated, after all, he stated in QC Lodge, it had been published in a perfectly reputable journal, AQC, it was quite specific about place and date, it was developed. And people then started saying, well, isn't it odd that Haydn didn't visit Masonic lodges when he was in London, given this connection with Freemasonry? Well, of course, there wasn't one, in the sense that Haydn was moving in royal circles and not Masonic ones, and Johann Peter Salomon was not a Freemason. And it's also said the connection between Haydn and Salomon was Freemasonry, and that obviously wasn't true, and the reason Salomon wanted to bring Mozart to London was because he was a Freemason, and as I say, because Salomon was not a Freemason, that connection was not Freemasonry. But it was believed, brethren, and it's repeated in the standard texts. Let me continue, brethren, by giving you 2 examples of myths widely believed and widely repeated concerning the ancients and the moderns, a subject that has been of considerable interest to members of this lodge. And I know at least 3 members of the lodge have actually published on the subject. The first of these myths is that the office of deacon is an ancient's office and not a modern's office, and that it was taken over by the moderns at the uniting of the Grand Lodges in 1813. That's not true, brethren. If you look at the minutes of the Lodge of Promulgation in 1808, you will find, in fact, there is a complaint that moderns' lodges were somewhat remiss in the appointing of deacons and in their installation ceremonies. And that, after all, was the Lodge of Promulgation, which was hand in glove with the Moderns Grand Lodge. The earliest examples I can find of deacons being appointed in moderns lodges is 1758 in Bristol, Lodge 220, where they appointed deacons, and in Halifax, in the Lodge of Probity number 61, in 1763 on the 24th of June, where two deacons, a junior and a senior deacon, were appointed. But Brother Harry Carr, in his Freemasonry at Work, discovered a much earlier example in 1743, long before the Ancients Grand Lodge was even created, of a lodge in Chester having deacons. The other example I want to give of a myth that is widely distributed is the business that it is said that the ancients worked not only the craft degrees, but the degrees beyond the craft in their craft lodges, under their craft warrants, but that the moderns worked only the 3 craft degrees. It's not true, brethren. It's not true at all. If you look at the minutes in the moderns lodges, you will find lots of examples of the moderns lodges, craft lodges, working the Royal Arch, for example. Now, it is true that the moderns set up a body to rule the Royal Arch, as we know, the Charter of Compact, 1767, and similarly for KT in 1791, the Grand Encampment. But if one looks to find out what actually happened in the craft lodges, you will find that the craft lodges were working the Royal Arch. It was a very popular degree in the 1760s, and Master Masons were obviously pretty keen to take that 4th step. If we go back to 1762, we can find the Royal Arch being worked in the lodge in York. And the lodge in York evidently got it from the lodge in Kingston upon Hull. And that seems to be what happened, brethren, that it spread in that sort of way, that Masons from one city would go to another city and be, as they used to say in those days, raised into the Royal Arch. Interesting use of word, predates Exalt by about 10 years. And of course is nowadays associated with the 3rd degree, and from what I've written before, you'll know that I see a very close relationship between the 3rd degree, or rather the Royal Arch is the completion of the 3rd degree. Then you will see that this particular situation was happening where Master Masons from one city would go to another city in order to learn the secrets of the Royal Arch, and then go back to their home and raise others. For example, in 1765, Lodge of Probity again in Halifax, 3 Masons from Leeds came. They had an extraordinary meeting on the Sunday, and they were raised, I'm using the term from the minutes, they were raised Royal Arch Masons, and they returned to Leeds to raise others. 6 months later, well, in July it was actually, in 1766, 3 Wakefield Masons turn up in Halifax and were similarly raised to the Royal Arch and went back to Wakefield. If I introduce you, say, to the minutes, for example, of Lodge 340, that's the Moderns Lodge in Sheffield working in the 1760s. In 1767, I think there were about 27, 28 Master Masons in that lodge. 16 of them Royal Arch Masons, brethren. But this is what's interesting. The first Royal Arch chapter, warranted by Supreme Grand Chapter in Sheffield, is the chapter of loyalty from the mid-1790s. They were making Royal Arch Masons from the 1760s, about 30 years before there was actually a warranted chapter in Sheffield. And the same is true in Halifax. I gave you the examples that they were making Royal Arch Masons in the early 1760s in Halifax. But the first warranted chapter in Halifax was the Chapter of Sincerity, which was warranted in 1790. So again, about 30 years of working the Royal Arch in a craft lodge. If I turn to Bristol, and I must turn to Bristol because of our member, Brother Anthony Baker, he wouldn't be very happy if I didn't mention Bristol here. In 1757, a Moderns Craft Lodge was warranted in Bristol. It's number 220, actually, is the number. And from 1758 until 1769, when Bristol gained its first warranted Royal Arch chapter, that craft lodge, the work of that craft lodge was essentially entirely making Royal Arch masons in a Moderns craft lodge. It is clear from the minutes of the lodges at the end of the 18th century that there was a very close relationship between the ancients and the moderns. The Deputy Grand Master of the ancients, Thomas Harper, the famous jeweller, was not just a member of a Moderns lodge, he was actually master of a Moderns lodge. And 5 Grand Lodge officers of the ancients held office in that same Moderns lodge, which was at that time number 15, now Globe Lodge number 23. Anyhow, brethren, I hope I've given you a few examples of the importance of looking at primary source material, particularly lodge minutes, and of not believing things you read, and certainly not repeating things you read unless you've checked that they are true. There's nothing wrong, brethren, with a good story, providing it is true. This lodge was set up to dispel the myths in Masonic history, and it clearly behoves all of us to follow in those exalted footsteps. Thank you, brethren, for your attention.